Thanks everyone for joining us today. We'll start shortly. Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Bijan Ahmadi and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD. IPD is a nonpartisan think tank committed to promoting and amplifying innovative thinking in North American foreign policy. We stand for dialogue, diplomacy, prudent realism, and military restraint. The principles which we believe are the four cornerstones of sustainable peace in an increasingly complex and dynamic international system. Today, we're hosting a one-on-one conversation titled The Sino-American Split at Sea with a Broken Compass with the Honorable Chas Freeman. This conversation is part of IPD's ongoing series on the current landscape of U.S. China relations. Now, allow me to briefly introduce Ambassador Freeman. Chas Freeman has served in several high-ranking roles in both the State Department and DoD. He was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from 1993 to 94, earning the highest public serving awards of the Department of Defense for his roles in designing a NATO-centered post-Cold War European security system and in reestablishing defense and military relations with China. He also served as U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Freeman worked as Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires in the American embassies at both Bangkok and Beijing. From 1979 to 1981, he was a director for Chinese affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Chas was the principal American interpreter during the late President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. Ambassador Freeman, welcome back to IPD. We're honored to have you with us today. And to lead this timely conversation with Ambassador Freeman, we have Dr. Wenran Jiang with us today. Dr. Jiang is an advisor at IPD, and also he's the president of Canada-China Energy and Environment Forum. His full bio is available on our website with the long list of his accomplishments, and I'm not going to go through it to save time. Wenran, thanks for being with us today. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bijan, for your introduction. I am also joining the IPD colleagues and our viewers to welcome Ambassador Freeman. I'm a longtime fan of your work and your in-depth intellectual insight and the distinguished diplomatic and then private career over the decades. I'm feeling extremely privileged to host you for this discussion today. So for those who just joined us, or maybe did not have a time to have a look at the details of today's central themes of the discussion, I just want to go through or read through our major description of today's event, just to give a more precise sense what's coming in the next hour. Today's topic is the Sino-American split at sea with a broken compass. So you can digest what that means, the title provided with us by Ambassador Freeman. So he will give us his perspectives on the mistaken assumptions in the U.S. China rivalry amid Washington's efforts to maintain its vision of the global order. We will also explore the underlying convictions of the Biden administration's China policy and the ideological assumptions behind the narrative of a renewed Cold War. So the dusk of Pax Americana has repositioned the U.S. foreign policy establishment in uncharted geopolitical waters. Competition between Washington and Beijing has given rise to a more confrontational form of organizing principles in the U.S.-China relationship. So how do notions of great power rivalry betrays the strategic objectives of American foreign policy? How do we evaluate claims of an ideological battle between Chinese authoritarianism and liberal democracy that have been seized upon by intellectuals of all stripes and the policymakers in the Beltway? Ambassador Freeman will share his reflections on these matters and their bearing on U.S. efforts to mobilize its Cold War allies vis-a-vis the Chinese challenge to its leadership over the international order. As the ambassador probes the futility of pursuing U.S. China antagonism as the defining quest of the 21st century, our discussion will also raise the possibility of reframing the Sino-American contest in terms that enable and sustain diplomacy. And our format today will be, for the first part, Ambassador Freeman will deliver his opening speech, giving a more systemic overview about his thought on the above topics, then followed by our discussion, maybe around 15 minutes. His opening maybe around half an hour. And then we'll do about 15 minutes. Based on his opening speech, I will do the follow-up. That will be followed by the live questions submitted by our viewers. And we have the IPD team organizing that, and we'll post it live to the ambassador. So without further delay, Ambassador Freeman, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Bijan and Unran, and thank you for those very kind introductions. The United States and China are no longer on speaking terms. Having put diplomacy aside, these two great powers are engaged in diatribe, accompanied by military posturing and preparations for a war in which the only certain outcome is the devastation of Taiwan. But the contest between America and China is not primarily military or ideological. It's about relative national strength and performance. China seems more focused on this reality than the United States. The Cold War is long over. America's unipolar moment has passed, and the Pax Americana, as you said, Wanran, is no more. With its demise, two changes in the American worldview have provided the geopolitical context for the descent of U.S. China and U.S. Russia relations into adversarial antagonism. The first was the assertion by Washington's securocrats that the world could be understood in U.S. foreign policy organized by reference to, quote, great power rivalry, unquote. The second is the claim by think tank liberal interventionists that an attack on democracy by predatory authoritarianism has become the central dynamic of history and world affairs. The Biden administration has embraced both theses. It presents them as firm convictions, not hypotheses. Together, they've given birth to the new American objective of a 21st century, quote, rules-bound order, unquote, crafted and led by the United States and its Cold War allies. This has no prospect of gaining international traction. The notion that great power rivalry is the core function or feature of international relations is best understood as a distillation of American militarism. It is a fantasy of the military-industrial complex. Great power rivalry is a concept that provides a rationale for unbounded defense spending by analogizing interactions between nations to those on a battlefield. It reduces foreign policy to zero-sum games between great powers while denying agency to middle-ranking and smaller powers in shaping the world order or determining their own destinies. Positing great power rivalry as the central feature of world affairs is an expression of nostalgia for the global feudalism of the Cold War, when lesser nations were necessarily caught between competing overlords and forced to defer to alien agendas. Not surprisingly, this premise has not found much welcome abroad. It's also now clear that great power rivalry is not the dialectic that will cure the entropy of post-Pax Americana global and regional disorder. What is emerging is a world of multidimensional interactions between countries in which almost all are driven more by their desire for autonomy than for alignment with the United States or its appointed great power rivals. Asked to choose a superpower or patron, middle-ranking and smaller powers almost invariably hedge and persist in pursuing their own interests as they see them. Foreign policies based on wistful remembrance of past supremacy and the misperception of contemporary infirmities are bound to fail. They are hallucinations that preclude successful navigation of the world's nearly fluid geopolitics, frustrate those who adopt them, and vex those to whom they are applied. They are not a basis on which to reaffirm U.S. global leadership. As for the claim that democracy is under attack by, quote, authoritarianism, unquote, this is good politics, but politically warped analysis. It appeals to Americans for many reasons. It appears to explain the deterioration of democratic norms in the United States as entirely the fault of foreigners, and thereby to absolve Americans of any responsibility for the increasing decadence of their own political culture. It embodies an unstated presupposition that democracy is the default political system of humankind, absent only when denied to a people by opponents who adhere to a putative ideology of authoritarianism. But long before there were politicians prepared to risk displacement from power by other politicians with more support at the polls, there were societies led by warlords, kings, dictators, and other strongmen. There still are. Democracy is not celebrated for the wisdom of its decision-making. It is revered as an antidote to social and political repression that, when tempered by the rule of law, enables levels of individual self-governance and orderly succession processes that no other system can match. Democratic norms appear to require many generations to establish themselves in human societies. The 20th and 21st centuries provide many examples of how quickly and thoroughly these norms can be discarded. The world's strongmen are almost all power-mad narcissists who have nothing in common other than the fear of being overthrown. They're happy to receive foreign support, but seek and find no market abroad for their personality cults or their country's idiosyncratic nationalisms. Lofty talk notwithstanding, the United States has been just as willing as China, Russia, and other great powers to sell weapons and internal security equipment to authoritarian governments, and has in fact outsold all others in such markets. Inventing persistent malevolence for Russia and predatory ideological aspirations for China serves US domestic political purposes. It puts otherwise confusing international politics back into the sort of Manichaean framework that animated World War II and the Cold War. Americans used to criticize China for its well-documented indifference to whether other countries were or were not democratic or devoted to the rule of law. Now we've found it convenient to reverse course and to attribute to China a values-laden crusade equivalent to and opposed to our own. But there is no evidence that Xi Jinping and the 92 million Communist Party members he leads are trying to erase democracy beyond China's borders. They are on the defensive against suspected homegrown and foreign efforts to discredit them, subvert their political economic achievements, and topple them from power. The thesis that China and America are engaged in mortal contention over what political system Americans or others should live under does not survive even minimal scrutiny. Democracy may be doing itself in here and there, but there's no league of foreign autocrats or authoritarian ideology seeking to obliterate it. The operative contest between China and America is not between competing political ideals, but between the two countries' abilities to exercise wealth and power, maintain domestic tranquility, and inspire emulation by other states and peoples. It is a contest that neither side will, quote, win, unquote. Flinging politically convenient but erroneous theories at China will not change this. Ironically, the United States has just fallen to number 25 on the Economist magazine's annual Worldwide Democracy Index, and is now categorized as a flawed and possibly failing democracy. This is disheartening. It's understandable that Americans prefer blaming Russia and other foreign miscreants to examining the internal causes of our decadence. But it is ironic that the Biden administration should choose this moment to, quote, stand up for democracy, unquote, and proclaim the existence of a global struggle between democracy and something called authoritarianism. Few abroad see things at all this way. The American Constitution assigned authority for policymaking almost entirely to the people's representatives in Congress. But the US president and the electorate have largely given up on the legislative branch. The president increasingly rules by decree and has acquired greater power than any king to make war on other nations and slaughter presumed enemies abroad. The erosion of constitutional democracy in the United States appears to me to be the result of a tragic combination of many factors, including the outrageous venality, chicanery, and effrontery of contemporary American politics, the recent emergence of a largely hereditary American plutocracy, an educated elite, the disillusionment of those farthest down with the American dream as equality of opportunity and social mobility visibly disappear from American society, elite condescension and indifference to the views of the uneducated and other members of the new and old American underclasses, the rise of social and niche media oligopolies with business plans dependent on the creation and maintenance of communities of shared preconceptions, the nurture by such media of social microcosms defined by shared delusions based on common grievances, alternative facts, the embrace of conspiracy theories and other politically relevant affinities, the organization through social media of increasingly violent protests by disgruntled white nationalists, Black victims of social and police prejudice, those recently demoted from the middle class, and other marginalized Americans. The exploitation of expert systems to entrench political privilege through gerrymandering and artificial intelligence and big data that manipulate the electorate. Elite insistence on pretentious standards of political correctness on issues that the more traditional and less fortunate find both intolerant and morally offensive. Reactions to political correctness and protests by those devoted to the vanishing status quo. It's quite a list of factors. A few of these clearly make the United States more vulnerable to foreign intervention in its internal affairs than before, but they are, without exception, domestic, not foreign in origin. They can only be fixed by Americans. Scapegoating Russia or China won't do a thing to remedy them. The world is rightly disbelieving of the sudden American argument that the dialectic driving history is the contradiction between democracy and autocracy. Those societies proudest of their democratic traditions are notably committed to the tolerance of political diversity both at home and abroad. None sees the overthrow of undemocratic regimes as an existential imperative or believes in the divine right of democracies to proclaim, impose, and enforce their preferred dispensations as a replacement for international law and consensus. To much of the world, the gathering of the G7 in Cornwall this June and its talk of the sanctity of an ill-defined, quote, rules-bound order, unquote, looked like the convening of a club of superannuated imperialists determined to regain the dominant role in rulemaking they lost along with their empires. The members of the G7 account for 11% of the world population, 30% of its GDP at purchasing power parity, and 62% of its accumulated wealth. The G7 made no case for its members' renewed stewardship of global order, but appeared to claim it as a sort of droit du seigneur. But non-Western, meaning non-Euro-Atlantic societies, constitute a very large global majority and are no longer prepared to be treated as vassals. As they rise from poverty, almost all are focused on escape from the trauma of past humiliation by Western imperialism and colonialism. Post-colonial stress disorder is today a major driver of foreign policy in every region touched by imperialism, including Eastern and Central Europe, where the humiliation was done by the Russian-dominated Soviet Union. It plays an outsized role in Hindu nationalism and Great Han chauvinism. Post-colonial hangover is a major explanation for phenomena like the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Arab uprisings of 2011. European colonialism has locked Africa into a love-hate relationship with its colonizers that's now coming home to roost through illegal migration. Latin America continues to resent ongoing interventions by the so-called Colossus of the North in places like Bolivia, Cuba, and Venezuela, even as many from the region look north for a better life. Southeast Asians, too, bear the scars of having been subjugated by European, American, and Japanese imperialism. Most of the world outside the United States and Europe sees the ongoing Israeli ethnic cleansing and settlement activity in Palestine as the last gasp of racist colonialism. Islamists identify the West with this and see it as justification for reprisal through terrorism. The operative division in global politics is manifestly not that between democracy and autocracy, but that between former colonizers and the colonized. This is joined as a driving force by the differences between those mainly Western nations who long ago became wealthy through industrialization and those now striving to do the same. The wealthy can protect their populations from phenomena like pandemics. The less developed and poor are left to suffer and die. The same is true of climate change. The earliest countries to industrialize were able to ignore pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. They now prefer not to allow those embarking on development to do the same. Demand from poor countries that they've compensated for 2 centuries of accumulated degradation of the climate by their former colonial masters fall on deaf ears. The inability of developing countries to forestall or remediate the catastrophic impact of rising temperatures in the seas, flooding and drought, or famine and pestilence promises to create an unbearable future for their inhabitants. The result will be widening chaos. For all these reasons, to most of the world, the arguments that the Biden administration is now making for a reformulated, quote, rules-bound order, unquote, ring hollow. Its appeals to other nations for deference to great power rivalry in combat with imaginary authoritarian predators have little appeal. To compete with China or other rising and resurgent powers in shaping the world of the future, America needs to make a case that is relevant to current realities. At present, China seems better aligned with these realities than the United States. This is truly unfortunate. The world has many problems that cannot be addressed without leadership by its greatest powers. And as America shirks the burdens of leadership, China remains focused on its own reconstitution, rejuvenation, technological advancement, and self-interested economic outreach. Beijing shows little willingness to lead other nations and has so far demonstrated no competence to do so. America doesn't want China to replace its global leadership. Neither, for the most part, does the world. Without at least some degree of accommodation and cooperation with China by the United States and between China, India, Japan, and other great powers, neither the United States nor China will be able to mount an effective response to the planet-wide challenges now facing humanity. China now seems overconfident, while the United States is mired in self-doubt. If, as the book of Proverbs puts it, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall, China looks like it's ripe for one or the other. Meanwhile, social and niche media in the United States have sliced, diced, and sorted Americans into disillusioned and mutually distrustful subcommunities that harbor incompatible visions of the American past and future and are no longer even on speaking terms with each other. Lacking unity, America seems politically splintered, scatterbrained, and unable to agree on much of anything, except that China must be opposed. Neither China nor America currently has much tolerance for ambiguity, nuance, or deviance from popular presuppositions or prejudices. Both have administrations that are obsessed with protecting leaders from criticism and that react badly to foreign censure or to homegrown unconventional ideas. Both are therefore prone to persist in error long after they should have identified and corrected it. A combination of solipsism and mutual disdain assures that Beijing and Washington no longer listen to each other. Both Chinese and American citizens now receive almost all information through digital filters in the form of media-certified and targeted judgments designed to reinforce established narratives. Neither citizenry is presented with many facts to contradict such judgments. Each finds it difficult to draw its own conclusions about trends and events touching national interests. In China, the information flow is government-controlled, anodyne, but upbeat about domestic matters, self-righteously nationalistic about foreign affairs, and calculated to unify the people politically. In America, it is corporate-controlled, discordant, bigoted about both domestic and foreign affairs, and tailored to facilitate the marketing of political opinions, as well as goods and services. Both systems treat objectivity as quaint and potentially subversive, and indulge in the propagation of claptrap. But the mediaverse in America has a much higher percentage of stuff that experts aptly describe with the technical term weird shit. In large measure, to placate nationalistic domestic audiences, both China and America appear to have decided to emulate the foreign policy of the Roman Emperor Caligula. His motto was Oderint dum metuant, let them hate us as long as they fear us. This was former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's idea of diplomacy. It appears to be that of today's China as well. So much for America making friends and influencing people, or China presenting itself as, quote, credible, lovable, and respectable, unquote. China's ruling Communist Party seems now to imagine that the brilliance of its ideology is responsible for China's economic and technological success. But its major contributions were to set aside its ideology, open the Chinese market to competition from foreign companies and their technologies, replace central planning with market economics and industrial policies, get out of the way of entrepreneurs, localities, and state-owned enterprises, curtail wasteful defense expenditures, and encourage the productive reinvestment of Chinese household savings. By stepping aside from micromanagement of the economy, the party liberated it. The Chinese people then launched themselves into a level of dog-eat-dog economic competition not seen since 19th century America. This spurred rapid productivity growth and deflated prices while enriching the lives of ordinary Chinese and enabling them to become the producers of 1/3 of the world's manufactures. These were truly amazing achievements, but they were stimulated by judicious withdrawals of state control rather than assertions of it. Now the controls seem to be going back on. This raises the possibility that, as has happened before in China's history, rising prosperity could fall victim to the arrogance and corruption of a domineering state bureaucracy. If this happens, Who will have the courage to tell the masters of the Chinese political universe that the reimposition of the nanny state risks triggering rather than precluding Luan unrest and reversing China's economic advance by blighting the aspirations for self-fulfillment of its enormous and growing middle class? China leapt into prosperity by embracing ideologically unpalatable realities. Now many see Beijing appearing to reverse verdicts on ideological agendas previously refuted by experience. Are we back to 政治挂帅, politics in command? What became of 实事求是, seek truth from facts, or 以实践为真理的唯一标准, practice is the sole criterion of truth? Doesn't China need such principles along with further 改革开放, reform and opening, to advance to the next stage of wealth and prestige? Of course, China now has a highly competitive, self-sustaining economy. China's development may slow, but it's most likely to continue long enough for a new generation less obsessed with the need for regimentation to rediscover the open-mindedness that catalyzed China's return to wealth and power. Sadly, whether China falters or not, the United States is presently in remarkably poor condition to compete with it. The infirmities of contemporary American democracy and its catastrophic inability to mobilize an effective response to the pandemic are telling, but the United States is now overmatched by China, or about to be, in just about every realm relevant to competition other than the military, and that too is increasingly uncertain. Most sectors of the Chinese economy are served by multiple competitive enterprises, whereas in the US economy, the norm is now oligopoly, monopoly, or monopsony. In China, companies still invest their profits in expanded industrial capacity. In the United States, where financialized shareholder capitalism now dominates, profits increasingly flow into stock buybacks, mergers, and acquisitions. China already accounts for 30% of global industrial production versus America's slightly more than 16%. China is the world's largest trading nation and the top economic partner of 3/4 of the world's countries. China now vies with the United States as the largest recipient of foreign direct investment. China has about 2.5 times the savings and investment capacity of the United States, and its government has surplus capital to export. America has become dependent on foreign purchases of around 40% of its debt just to run existing government operations, let alone launch new programs. China is rapidly rising in the ranks of the world's innovators, while the United States, although still formidable, is slowly declining. Students in China's schools rank #1 in the world in math and science, while American students rank 37th and 18th, respectively. There are now 8 times as many scientists, technicians, engineers, and mathematicians in China as there are in the United States. And if nothing changes at the end of this decade, there will be 15 times as many. China has provided 1/3 of the total global growth in research and development expenditures in this century versus America's 1/5. China and the US each account for about 1/4 of worldwide spending on R&D, but China passed the United States in 2019 and now spends much more on basic research than the United States, where most R&D is now business-funded incremental product development. In China, government spending reflects strategic calculation. In America, it reflects the vector of vested interests lobbying of Congress. Chinese transportation and communications infrastructure is the world's newest and most efficient, while deferred maintenance on America's roads, bridges, railroads, and air and seaports is over $2.5 trillion. The Congress is now crowing about having just allocated about $110 billion annually in new spending over the next 5 years, new spending for infrastructure, but this is far, far short of what is required. China now allocates much less than 2% of its GDP to the military versus America's 3.4 to 5.25%. If China were a NATO member, the United States would be berating it for spending much too little on defense. China can surge defense expenditures and production, whereas the United States no longer can. The greatest comparative advantage of the United States has come to be its professional and highly lethal military. This makes it politically convenient for Americans to portray the contest the United States has launched with China in military terms. China is showing that it can match and raise anything the United States does. But military posturing is an exercise in futility. Sino-American war over the misunderstood Taiwan problem, the most probable casus belli, would leave Taiwan in ruins and could leave both the United States and China, our homelands, devastated. Both would lose from any war if they did not destroy each other outright. They would be mad to go to war with each other. We must do what we can to ensure that they never do. The Sino-American contest is not about which side can outposture or outarm the other militarily. It's about the underlying sources of national strength and performance. These do not currently favor the United States. American competitiveness vis-a-vis China will not be enhanced by more American military spending or the pivoting of the US Armed Forces to East Asia. Meeting the challenge will require a level of investment in the future of the United States that is unimaginable without an end to the American hubris, denial, and complacency that have gutted fiscal responsibility, diverted wealth to the plutocracy, attracted the best and brightest to financial rather than real engineering, suffocated competitive markets, atrophied industry, institutionalized inefficiency and rake-offs in sectors like education and health, squeezed the middle class, and decimated the capacity of the government to respond to crises. Nothing less will do. And that is why it distresses me as an American to say that while China will not gain from the Sino-American split, the United States seems very likely to lose from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Freeman. That is very thought-provoking, and you covered so many issues in your speech. Even as myself, done some homework over time, reading your recent speeches and writings in policy journals. I'm still quite deeply moved by the kind of insights that you provided with our viewers. So again, here we have limited time, maybe in the next 30 minutes also. I'll spend probably some time to follow up with you in a number of fronts. You talked extensively about this democracy versus authoritarianism, the kind of new value-based liberal interpretation of the China challenge, and you do not see that as a valid situation. And you mentioned China succeeded by putting ideologies aside. I mean, when you were in China in 1972 with former President Richard Nixon as his principal interpreter, I myself from Harbin, still as a teenager, going through Cultural Revolution and trying to figure out the outside world. But that was an extremely ideologically loaded period of time of China. And you mentioned that in other writings, China no longer pursues that revolutionary extreme agenda today. But I want to touch upon this particular area that you say, well, American model of democracy is not quite stand up to this antagonistic new definition of based on ideology and values. And America being classified as a deficient, if not a broken democracy. But what about the other democracies, such as we're in Canada, in Australia, in Northern European countries, EU countries? Many of these countries are pursuing a much more what we call advanced form of more equalized democratic system. That's quite different from the United States. Their fear, Canada's fear, clearly, I can feel it living here, immigrated to Canada for decades, is real. A fear about the China system. Even China does not export its ideology today. So how do you respond to people who say the very existence of China's political system by default is some kind of a threat to Western democratic ideals and way of life, if not modeled by Americans, but there are other democracies. How do you respond to that, Ambassador?
Well, I'd note, first of all, that the argument that this is all about democracy versus authoritarianism has its greatest currency in what I call the Anglosphere, meaning the English-speaking countries that descend from Great Britain and its Westminster-style democracy. So you find Australia has been singled out by China as a surrogate for the United States in terms of invective, tongue lashing, and trade restrictions. Clearly, if China didn't understand the damage that it would do to itself by doing the same to the United States, it would have done that to the United States. Canada and New Zealand, as well as Great Britain, are in a somewhat different category. And I think the American Republic, which has a written constitution, and which is increasingly ignoring its own constitution, is in sad shape. I don't think that's the case with the parliamentary democracies in the other Anglophone countries. So the final point is this. There's a peculiar Messianic nature to the American idea of democracy, perhaps because we were born in a revolution. We were the first great democracy. And there are many Americans who seem to imagine that until the entire world is converted to democracy or Christianity or some other cause, democracy is in peril. This is not uncommon. This is what the communists believed in the Soviet Union. Until everyone became communist, the Soviet Union would be in danger. Now we believe until everybody becomes democratic, democracy is in danger. But the fact is that our democracy is rotting internally. It is not being threatened externally. And Messianic democracy is not a value that is shared by other great democracies like India, or for that matter, the European Union democracies. Now, they are democracies to one extent or another, but they don't feel obliged to overthrow other regimes in order to democratize them. So I think Canada is wise to be concerned about what the great elephant to the south that it sleeps with is up to. And it's wise to be concerned about China because China does pose a challenge in terms of its ability to mobilize people for specific ends, apparently much better than most democracies do. Democracies need to rediscover common sense and political leadership if we are going to compete.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. Just to pursue that point further, if at the baseline that the Western fears of China has some reasons, but then the Western model, the democratic form of government, is also quite flawed, and in many areas, including in Canada, I should say, there are concerns about so-called decay, right? As the political theorists would call it historically, from the ancient Greek philosophers to current. But then the alternative, do we have an alternative? Is China now posing a new so-called, if not a ideological challenge, but by its own success in the past several decades, maybe representing a competition model to the West? And my colleague, Canadian scholar Daniel Bell, writes about China's model based on good governance, efficient governments rather, and meritocracy, not the meritocracy that you mentioned about U.S. bureaucracy. Can you comment on the trajectory of the current Chinese existence in terms of its own road or model, what do we call it, and is challenge the Western path, I mean, of the system? If you can just briefly touch upon that. Yeah.
Let me just say a couple of things. First, the good news is that the Chinese don't give a fig how Canada or the United States govern ourselves. They really don't care. The next good news is that Americans and Canadians have no desire to become Chinese or adopt the Chinese model. And this just illustrates some of the vapidity, the vacuousness of the argument that this is all about democracy versus some sort of Chinese hegemonic model. However, it's very interesting if you read the social, the classical documents of Chinese Confucianism, you will find Mengzi, I believe, saying that the definition of a good state is one where a wallet left on the road is returned to its owner, and that a good state exercises influence abroad by setting a good example that others want to copy. This used to be the American approach to influence operations, as they are now called, extending our influence abroad. We need to rediscover it. And I guess the final point is this: whether we like the Chinese system or not, and I'm personally quite happy not to be living under it, whether we like that system or not, that there are things that the Chinese are doing from which we can and must learn. And this is not just technology. And, you know, there was in the 19th century, China was agitated about this very same question. What to do about the so-called national essence, or guocui? You know, should we import foreign ideas or just foreign technology? I see some of the same thing now in the United States. You know, should we import foreign ideas or just the technology, or maybe neither? You know, this is echoes arguments that occurred in the late Qing. It's very ironic. Anyway, I hope we can find our way back as a nation, and more broadly, the world's democracies can find their way back to open-minded exploration of best practices abroad, wherever they are, including in China. I like what the Prophet Muhammad said. He said, if you are looking for knowledge, you should go as far away as China to find it. And I think we need to be more open-minded, more tolerant. I think we need to accept that the world contains many diverse political cultures, and people are entitled to build their own political culture. They don't need to submit to ours, however much we may admire it ourselves.
Well, thank you. That is a very, I would say, sophisticated and nuanced analysis and a look at the world from someone like you who has been living through it, but also making some of the very fundamental changes in your career. I'm moving forward to the more structural aspects of the so-called U.S. China rivalry that you mentioned. Let's put the ideologies and values aside that we discussed extensively already. What about people say, look, China is rising, U.S. Is an existing superpower. There's what Harvard scholar Graham Allison called the Thucydides trap, that the inevitable rising power will go into war with the existing, superpower. So people say, forget about ideologies or values. It's totally structural. China is about to take over the United States. United States cannot allow it, period. Even today, we have the whatever, Hu Jintao second, Jiang Zemin third, not Xi Jinping, or even bring back Zhao Ziyang to do more political reform. U.S. would not structurally treat China any differently from today's policies. What do you tell us, our viewers, about those so-called structural or fatalistic or destination to war kind of argument, saying has nothing to do with values, it's all about power politics?
Well, I think we need to start by recognizing that sometime around 1870, the United States became the largest economy in the world, and we have been the largest economy in the world ever since. China is now twice our size industrially, which is far more important in many ways. And, if this were a contest over how many insurance agents or real estate brokers one side or the other had, we would win hands down, but it's not over that sort of thing. It is over power, as you said. And it's very hard for us to adjust to, once again, not being number one. But we have to. Nothing is forever in the world. And, we have huge advantages. We, in North America, we are blessed with an abundance of agricultural land and water and diverse populations and great seas that protect us from most enemies. United States has Canada to the north, and Canadians are famous for being excessively polite and deferential. We have Mexicans to the south, and I went to university there, and I can testify that they're more interested in having fun than causing trouble. So we're in a great position if we have the right policies. And there is the phrase in, 知己知彼, that to know yourself and know the other is to position yourself for success. I don't think we know China very well. I think we project many fantasies onto it. I don't think we know ourselves very well either. And we need to engage in a bit of introspection. I was struck, tomorrow is the anniversary of 9/11. So this morning I was listening to the radio, and there were teachers talking about how they teach about 9/11 to kids who weren't even conceived back then, for whom this sounds like Pearl Harbor or Lexington and Concord. And I thought to myself, what are they teaching? Are they teaching that this was a reprisal for American intervention abroad, which is what the people who did it thought it was? Or are they teaching what George W. Bush said, namely that they did this because they hate us because we're Democrats? Have we looked into our own behavior and performance and reached the right conclusions? I don't think so. And I think we do need a period of introspection. We have too many problems. Our democracy is not working. It is not making decisions that it needs to. We have a breakdown of the spirit of compromise, which is essential to any democracy. We are pursuing, as I suggested, erroneous, unpersuasive theories with our allies and friends and enemies abroad. We need to rethink things. We need a reset, and it can only come from us. So that is my conclusion, is that let China do whatever it wants to do. It may screw up its advance, as I indicated. I can remember, and I will end here, having a conversation with a number of Chinese intellectuals about the return of Hong Kong to the so-called motherland. And I was very optimistic. I said, this is probably going to change China more than it will change Hong Kong, which in fact turned out to be true. But I said, and China's never going to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, namely Hong Kong. To which a professor responded, Chinese history is littered with the carcasses of dead geese. China is quite capable of fouling up its own advance. Nothing is written. Everything is open. But we are fouling up our own advance, and we need to correct that.
Well, this is fascinating because as I have many questions, I've been thinking and prepared to talk to you. I'm also reading the questions, many questions coming in from our live viewers, summarized by our IPD colleagues. I'm just now naturally incorporating some of these viewers' questions and pose it to you during our flow of the discussion. Just on the structural side, you, during your speech, you actually spent some time to list the strengths of the Chinese industrial power and with a lot of data. And you are also speaking critically about U.S., saying it's declining in industrial capacity, lack of competitiveness other than military, it's science and technology, economy is falling behind. U.S. is in self-doubt. China is overconfident, as you put it. What about the questions from our viewers who are saying there are also structural factors in this rivalry, if you call it, that does not favor China? For example, the declining demographic factors of China's fast aging population. I remember this very vividly. 2 years ago, I had a major debate with a well-known Canadian scholar on the issue of if China will be the next superpower. Of course, I'm on the pro side, and she was on the against side. And her opening statement against China to be the next superpower is very clear. Demography will not make China a superpower. It will become old before it becomes strong and rich. What do you say to that structural factor about the projection about next, say, 10, 20, 30 decades ahead? Are we over with Americans with a decisive Chinese win, or factors like this would actually play against China?
Well, I think China's got all sorts of terrible problems. It industrialized so rapidly that it has polluted much of its soil and its water. The environmental conditions have been terrible. The demographic consequences of the one child per family policy are now catching up with China. I don't agree with the statement that China will grow old before it grows rich, however, just as I don't agree with the idea that China can't clean up its environment. I think both are entirely fixable problems. Now, China needs to do some things that are very hard. For example, if it wants more children for the future, it has to provide childcare on a different basis than having women retire at age 50 and take care of kids at home, which is the way the Chinese system works. There have to be changes, yes. But the idea that somehow or other the elderly, meaning people somewhat younger than me, the idea that the elderly do not cease to be productive is nonsense. China is now the largest producer and installer of robotics in the world. A great many things are being automated. The labor supply is a problem for Chinese companies at the moment, and they are automating. They are also offshoring to places like Ethiopia and Bangladesh, where labor costs are low. I don't see this as a fundamental obstacle to China's continued growth and strength. Japan has handled it, although with very unfortunate economic policies after the Plaza Accords revalued the yen. I'm quite optimistic about the Chinese capacity to solve these things. I think meritocratic government has something to be said for it, and I suspect that there will be ups and downs But the seriousness and competence of the leadership in China is not in doubt. What is in doubt is their willingness to tolerate dissent, which is constructive in my view. If they don't tolerate criticism internally or from their friends abroad, how will they correct their errors? That is the question I ask. I think that's a bigger threat than the demographic one.
Okay. Well, thank you. Just let our viewers know that we normally schedule such sessions between about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. We're about at an hour mark. We'll do it for another 15 minutes because I see the discussions ongoing and there are many people online, many questions coming in. Ambassador Freeman, yeah, I would like to move now towards more policy-oriented dimensions of the U.S. China relations. I'm talking to my IPD colleagues before, in preparation for this. I reach out to my colleagues, some of them prominent in the policy and academic community in Canada, United States, and in China. Many of them are, of course, feeling a little bit depressed for those who are pro-engagement. They would really want me to ask you the questions of the Biden administration's posture and basic policy standing towards China. They're saying it looks like Biden policies are more resembling to the Trump China policies so far after 8 or 9 months than returning to Obama policies when Biden served as a vice president. I mean, what is going on? I mean, just before online coming on air, we briefly discussed last night or yesterday, Xi Jinping and Biden had a 90 minutes conversation. Could you give our viewers, based on your experience, on where policy-wise both sides are going? I mean, this is all pretty negative at the moment, right? Or how do you put that? Just give us more details, please.
I think as far as the Biden administration is concerned, 政治挂帅. It is domestic politics that are in command. There is no advantage to taking on the issue of a new China policy or even conducting a review. There is no review going on. There was a sort of review in the Defense Department, which had to do with campaign plans and deployments. But there's been no fundamental review of China policy since the Biden administration came into office, because that would be politically not just unproductive, but dangerous.
Yeah.
Mr. Biden is trying to get legislation through the Congress in a circumstance where the 50-50 split in the Senate gives a couple of conservative Democrats the veto power. In the House, the margin is very low. Unless and until he has a substantial, comfortable majority in both bodies, he has to walk very carefully on things that will invite attack by the Republicans. And he's opted not to invite attack. So therefore, you're entirely correct. He has found it expedient to continue the Trump administration policies. Now, I opened my prepared remarks by saying that the United States and China are no longer on speaking terms. And yet, last night, as you said, or yesterday, there was a 90-minute conversation. I think the point that Xi Jinping made during that conversation, if I understand it, is that as long as the United States continues to insult China and attack China and give China no respect, no mianzi, no face, it is not possible for us to deal with concrete issues in a cooperative fashion. Mm-hmm. I don't find that at all surprising. I suspect that everyone who's watching this has at one point or another had a terrible falling out with someone. And if you continue that through diatribe, insults, backbiting, conspiracy theories, attribution of all sorts of moral failings to the other person, you're not going to get that person's cooperation on anything, quite the opposite. So I think the atmosphere now does not favor a summit meeting. It cannot come about without an improvement in the atmosphere. If it were to occur now, it would probably cement the mutual hostility. One final note. You might use the word rivalry. I think of rivalry as constructive competition. That is to say, rivalry is about improving your own performance so that you can win in a sports event, or you can, play chess better, or you can perform better on the battlefield. That is rivalry. Adversarial antagonism is where you try to hobble, you try to hamstring the other party, you try to win not by improving yourself, but by injuring the other party. And of course, enmity is where you try to destroy the other party. We're not there yet. Although some contingencies, like the Taiwan contingency, could lead us into enmity and even a nuclear exchange. But where we are now is past rivalry. We are in adversarial antagonism.
Okay, this is the outlook doesn't seem to be as optimistic, and there are people posting questions saying what would be the path that two countries and the leaders at the policy level or the strategic thinking level actually return to some kind of a constructive dialogue to move back from this adversary relationship to some kind of a constructive competition. As you say, competition is not a bad thing if we're conducted on terms. But overall, among the several C's, competition, confrontation, collaboration, cooperation, it seems to be at least interpreted or seen by the outside world or interpreted by China. The U.S. side is taking confrontation and competition a lot more than the cooperation side. And the Chinese basically saying, you cannot pick and choose. When you want to do cooperation, you come to us. When you want to unfairly strike us in competition and confrontation, you use all the other tactics such as, banning Huawei and so on. What do you say to those people who want to know how do we move to a more constructive path? Here,
I would begin by thinking about what Otto von Bismarck, who was not exactly a naive and soft-minded person, said. He said, you should always be polite, even when you are delivering a declaration of war. So the first premise is that we have to restore a measure of demonstrated mutual respect. Second, we need to try to think about what the other side is concerned about and why they are concerned about it. We need to redevelop a capacity for empathy. Because the essence of diplomacy is to persuade another party that it's in their interest to do things your way because that accords with their interests as well as yours. That is the basis for constructive engagement. It doesn't mean you're not wary, you don't watch out for tricks. Of course you do. But the first thing is to correct the atmosphere. Then I think we need to look at this relationship not in terms of how we can hurt each other, which is what we have been trying to do, but in terms of how we can benefit from each other. I'll give you the examples. There's hardly anything quite as stupid as the ban on silicon from Xinjiang because of alleged forced labor there, which has not been proven, by the way, but it's an allegation and it's one that people take seriously, and they should. But banning silicon while you're simultaneously trying to improve the use of solar power is crazy. The two objectives don't come together. And so hurting Hong Kong to punish China doesn't make sense if you're trying to preserve as much freedom as possible in Hong Kong after the national security law. You don't do what we're doing. we should be looking at China's prosperity, its advance, for ways in which we can benefit from it.
Yeah.
And I will add, just because you're Canadian, that we should stop the hostage taking. That means Meng Wanzhou, that was a legally contrived hostage taking, in my view. I'm sorry the Canadian government deferred to my own on that so far. The result has been the capture and kidnapping and hostage taking by China of two worthy young Canadians who, as far as I know, have done nothing wrong. This should be put behind us. We should not continue with this practice. In fact, we should be discussing how to avoid this kind of thing in the future, because it is enormously destructive. It arouses patriotic passions in both China and the United States and Canada. And so, again, let us try to rediscover the merit of polite dialogue about things that benefit us, rather than diatribe directed at hurting the other side.
Ambassador, I'm so glad you brought up the Canadian dimension. Many, primarily our audience viewers are from Canada during this session, although we do have people around the world, Europe, Australia, China as well. That Canadian dimension you mentioned, I just want to say we have a federal election going on. Last night, we had the federal politicians representing different parties had the only English debate, during which the Conservative Party leader, Aaron O'Toole, just lashed out as Justin Trudeau. There was one period of question on 5 minutes on China relations came up other than Afghanistan to our foreign policy issues. Conservative position that the platform is extremely hostile towards China. If you read the platform, it's more hawkish than the Trump hawks in the United States, trying to out-hawk Scott Morrison in Australia. But you're saying this is all going in the wrong direction. But the question for countries like Canada and other allies, you mentioned about Anglo-Saxon sphere, led by the US and they're the EU countries. People were asking me to ask you this question because you say people, middle, small powers, will, based on their own interests, to choose and manage size. They no longer wanted to be into this US versus USSR bloc situation during the Cold War. But do we really have a choice? If the Biden administration does not reverse away from making China as its kind of enemy, do we have a choice, like in Canada, not to going along with American approach, unlike other EU countries? Because people tend to say, between the devils, we deal with the devils the way we know. And Americans, if put in a more not positive manner, we depend on Americans for 3/4 of our trade. And we really had little choice. More people also arguing we do have a ideological and value affiliation with our American allies, no matter how you say about China. How do you respond to that? What do we do in Canada as a middle or even now classified as a small power? Can we bridge? Can we do something different? Or we have no choice but to be on board with American policy towards China?
That's a very fundamental question.
Yeah.
Having to do with the difficult relationship between the United States and its smaller northern neighbor, Canada. Before I address it, let me just make one observation. I think much of the world is frankly disgusted by the inability of China and the United States to manage our bilateral relationship in a way that is productive and useful and enables the resolution, or at least the addressing of problems like climate change, the pandemic, and other matters that really demand cooperation. So I don't think Canada, if it finds the US mismanagement of the relationship with China disturbing and even threatening, or finds Chinese mishandling of the American relationship disturbing and threatening, is doing anything that's unusual. You should be worried about this. However, having said that, I think the world is moving into a new form of order in which countries, medium-sized countries, smaller countries, demand more space for their own decision-making, and will get it. The very existence of the difficult relations between the great powers, the greatest powers, makes space for smaller countries or less middle-ranking countries. Now, Canada has a great deal to offer. You have a political culture which I think still appeals a great deal to people throughout the world, including to many in the United States. Sometimes, we define Canadians this way. Canadians are just Americans who don't have guns and do have healthcare insurance. I think Canada has some real appeal and influence based on exactly the principle that Meng Tse long ago, like George Washington, enunciated, namely set a good example and people will want to have a good relationship with you and learn from you. And that is a role that Canada has historically played and can continue to play. So I'd say go to it and don't worry too much about the yahoos to the south.
Thank you. This is a great sage advice. We in Canada here much appreciate that. One more question before we close, because we have people asking, given what we witnessed of the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, it poses serious doubts about U.S. ability or the willingness to actually put together whatever coalition. When Secretary Antony Blinken was dealing with China from the point of strength, he really means 发扬我们的长处, right? Our advantage rather than the material strength. That is to mobilize allies. Unfortunately, you are the principal interpreter. That was interpreted by China as 实力. So Yang Jiechi would tell Blinken in Alaska, you cannot talk to us from the position of strength. But when he was giving speeches talking about the strength, it's really to put together an ally system. Now that ally system, given what happened in Afghanistan, is in doubt. So people are asking, would U.S. deal with China from the position of unilateralism? At some point, as Trump did on the phase 1 U.S. China trade deal, it wasn't really considering the interest of Canada or Australia in certain sectors, just really put us aside on agriculture, on energy, and went ahead as a managed trade with China. We are worried as Canadians to be on board with Americans as our allies and friends, and yet at crucial moment, we might be abandoned by a unilateral U.S. Position. Do you see that as will happen to the China front, or China is too big for U.S. to ignore the allies? How do you see that?
Well, I'd begin by refuting, or dismissing much of the criticism of the United States with regard to Afghanistan. Afghanistan did not show military weakness on the part of the United States. It did not show an unwillingness to use force by the United States. Quite the contrary. What it showed was an obstinate stupidity over the course of 20 years. You can count on us to be obstinate and sometimes stupid in defense of other countries. So I don't think that's the problem. The problem is exactly the one you mentioned, and that is the propensity for unilateralism. We pulled out of Afghanistan without warning in a manner that did not coordinate adequately with our NATO allies. The manner in which we pulled out, as opposed to the manner in which we conducted ourselves while in Afghanistan, following the terrible demonstration of incompetence in dealing with the pandemic seems to once again show that the United States is not only incompetent, but selfish and unilateral in its behavior. So that's something, as an American, I hope we will work on, because I think our strength is enhanced by aggregating the power of others to our own through considerate alliances. And I think that is the key to affordable security for the United States. So I'm strongly in favor of paying attention to, listening to, coordinating with, discussing matters honestly with our allies before we do things. On the other hand, there's no evidence to suggest that we're going to change and do that. So I guess my advice to Canada and other middle-ranking powers would be, yes, you can work with the United States under most circumstances. It will be of great advantage to you. You need to have a good relationship with the United States, but you better have your own ability to act on your own too. And when the chips are down, you need to be able to defend your own interests and values on your own.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. I'm looking at the clock is ticking. There's so many questions still coming in, so many things I want to discuss. But we have managed, I think, over an hour, mostly focusing on the bigger picture issues, more strategic oriented issues. I think that is really what our viewers, and like myself and others, would like to hear from you. Let me pose the final question and then ask you to put your thought, wrap it up. And I want to be frank about it. If I remember correctly, you received the highest civilian award honor with this department, with the Pentagon, with Departments of Defense in the early 1990s for putting together the post-Cold War NATO security architecture, as well as restoring U.S. China military dialogue after the aftermath of the student protest in Tiananmen in 1989. You were in charge of policy at that time. You made those very good contributions, but today you're no longer in that position. You're retired diplomats. You continue to speak on these things. People asking me and asking you, how can you make sure your good advice, your very good views, policy recommendations can actually get traction with the current people in charge? How do you respond to that?
I've always thought that ideas, policy proposals were independent and more important than who proposed those ideas or advocated those policies. So my answer to your question is, I try to put forward ideas which I think have their own merit, stand on their own, but I cannot force people to accept those ideas. The old saying has it, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So the most I can do is register my objections to error as I see it, and to argue for a different approach. But it's up to the American public and to the international public and to other public intellectuals perhaps to pick up those ideas and either accept or refute them. So I try to keep an active life in terms of thinking and speaking, but I'm very aware that I'm strictly marginalized in terms of any influence in today's Washington or today's Beijing for that matter. And I thank God for my retirement. I'm enjoying it.
Thank you very much. But you're moderate. But I do believe, I share your views that we should not subject to pessimistic structural forces that lead us to negative outcomes. You're still believing in the active agency influence, and I think you have you're continuing to play a very vital part in our continuous discourse on China, on U.S., on bilateral relations, and we are very much enjoying your presence. I want our viewers to read Ambassador Freeman's writings and speeches at his website, which is Chas Freeman, one word, chasfreeman.net. I benefited from reading from it, and many of his views on U.S.-China relations beyond today's topics are there online, chasfreeman.net. So please visit. There are also, we did not cover today, but I want to let people know, Ambassador Freeman is critical in the North American audience largely on American foreign policy, but when he did, and when he speaks with the Chinese audience, he has been very critical to how China handled its side of the policy. And in one speeches, I think he mentioned China now has blown a Australia-sized hole for its international reputation. But that's not the focus of today's discussion. Maybe we will find another time, but do read it. Don't walk away saying, oh, Ambassador Freeman, too negative on the US, too positive on China. You are very balanced. We appreciate your views. And therefore, I thank you for your time. I thank our viewers for participating, submitting questions. And I thank the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy to continuously hosting such quality events to have distinguished guests like Ambassador Freeman to be with us. I don't know, do you have final words, thoughts? The floor is yours, Ambassador, if you want to say a few words.
Just thank you very much, Wanran, and I thank the Institute for this opportunity to express my views. I will post the text of my remarks on the website, which, as you said, is Chas Freeman, all one word, CHASFREEMAN.net. So anyone who wants to review that, what I said, will find it there. And I thank you, and I think we should let everyone enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. Yes, our live recording will be also be online at the IPD website very shortly, together with Ambassador's speech text and other resources. We will also do an event summary for those who may tell your colleagues if you missed this valuable conversation with Ambassador, please go and catch up later, get online. Again, thank you, Ambassador Freeman, for being with us. We hope in the future to have you on other related topics, and enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.